This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, in-depth conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, scientists and Mataranga Māori, brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Scientists. Kia ora, I'm Trudi.
And I'm Dr Barb, and we are here today. We've got an amazing guest speaker today, and we're very happy to have for our Good Friday special.
Oh, yes.
Someone who is going to talk about values and the meaning of life and facts and fiction. And
so it's not 49, 54 or whatever, the meaning
42,
of life.
42.
So it's not 42.
Welcome, Charles. So we have here in the studio today Professor Charles Pigden.
Hello.
Thank you for coming. So I've got a little intro so people know who you are and what you've done, because you have had quite an illustrious career.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So after graduating from King's College, Cambridge in 1979, Charles Pigden spent 5 years studying at La Trobe in Australia before first coming to Otago as a postdoctoral fellow in 1986. After a brief stint teaching at Massey, he returned to Otago as a lecturer in 1988, where he has taught ever since. I didn't even realise Massey had a philosophy department.
Oh, yes. Come on.
It does?
It does.
Yeah. I'm very Otago-centric. Charles has published on a wide range of subjects, from the analytic-synthetic distinction through truth-maker theory and the existence or otherwise of abstract objects to Jane Austen's Mr. Eliot. So I'm very interested to hear about Jane Austen and philosophy and how that works together.
It's only because you like clothes, yeah.
It's not because I like clothes, it's because I like Sense and Sensibility. But we may leave that for another time.
You want to talk about, like the appalling decline in women's fashions from the Regency to the mid-Victorian period. You look at people, you look at women in Regency clothes and you think, wow, that looks cool. She looks wonderful. And then you see the same person, years later in Victorian clothes, and she looks like a bundle of cloth.
True. It's interesting because I feel like throughout this episode, Charles and I may take opposite sides on most things, because I always look at those Regency women's dress and think, oh God, they look cold. They look really cold. All those flimsy white flowing things. I mean, I like the Empire waistline, but I do think
waistline's good.
I do think a bit of structure, and they just look warmer. And all those big, the Carolines and the big swirling skirts and petticoats that they had later in the
Okay,
1800s.
well, let's talk about somebody in particular. There's a famous hostess. She was the sister of one prime minister and the mistress and later the wife of another. So
wow.
Her name was Emily Lady Cooper, subsequently Lady Palmerston. So she was the sister of Lord Melbourne and the lover and subsequent wife of Lord Palmerston. And you see pictures of her when she was a young hostess at Almack's, which was a fashionable high society club. Mm. And apparently she was one of this group of high-born ladies who dominated it. And unlike the rest of them, she wasn't a bitch.
Right. But how do we know that? How do we know that? Well, this
because
time
everybody
later.
said so. Everybody said, "Oh, she's so nice." Unlike Lady X, I can't stand Lady X, but Lady Cooper, as she then was, such a nice woman, also really sexy, and
how does this go to the clothes?
We're getting there.
We're getting there, and you see her as a young woman, and she just looks great. Think, wow, she looks great, but the clothes look good too. Beautiful line. And then you see her later in life. And as I say, she just looks like a bundle of cloth.
I don't know. I mean, what do they say? All that's green is golden. I mean, it's hard to say that. I do think it's hard to tease apart someone in the prime of their youth.
There's the issue that she's older, but apparently people thought that for quite a long time, even when she was quite an old lady, she was kind of a sort of good-looking old lady. Yeah. But the clothes just are so unbecoming.
Yeah.
So I happened to be reading about them.
It might just have been, they were quite different silhouettes, so maybe the style just suited her more of that early Regency period.
Well, it's hard to believe that this could suit could suit anyone. I just think.
Okay, Bridgerton versus the Dunedin line. I'd take Bridgerton any day. So
yeah, Bridgerton line clothes. Yes, definitely in favour of them. However, we really drifted away from the main topics.
So I'll go back to the rest of your introduction, because I'm terrible at getting halfway through an introduction and then starting some sort of tentative argument and then not finishing the introduction of the guest, aren't I, Trudi?
I don't think I even need to answer that, but yeah.
So Charles, he is, as they say, a Russell scholar. He has edited Russell on Ethics, 1999, which won the Bertrand Russell Society Book Award for 2000. Contributed the chapter on ethics to the Cambridge Companion to Bertrand Russell, and written the entry on Russell's moral philosophy for the Stanford Online Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So I think we can say a verifiable, objective expert on Russell.
I agree.
He's also an expert on the philosophy of conspiracy theories, being the first to revive the issue after Popper's denunciations of conspiracy theorising in the 40s, 50s and 60s. So Popper's famously Otago based.
He was Christchurch rather than Otago, but yes. Yeah, I mean, possibly the greatest work on political philosophy ever written in New Zealand was Popper's Open Society in Its Enemies, which he composed while he was kind of in exile here, because he was originally from Vienna, because he was Jewish. So he fled the Nazis before they really took power, because he could see what was coming.
Yeah.
And the very interesting thing about Popper is that he had two job offers in exile, so to speak. A job at Cambridge and a job at Canterbury Christchurch. And he gave up the job at Cambridge for the sake of another refugee.
Oh,
because he had a solid thing from
Christchurch,
where the Cambridge job was a job for refugees, whereas the Canterbury job was a job that he had anyway. Yeah, so he gave it up, which was kind of self-sacrificing.
Well, it didn't do him too bad though either, did it?
Well, not in the end, but at the time
to Christchurch in the late 1930s.
And it is a big step. But
what was the other thing about it?
I thought you were going to say that he got the atlas wrong. He thought that Christchurch, when he said Christchurch, I thought he was going to. No. He misunderstood the Christchurch that we were talking about.
And he made a major contribution to the development of higher education in New Zealand. He had a really big impact. And what else about him? Oh, here's another thing about him which is kind of interesting. He, even though people didn't like him much because he was kind of awkward and arrogant, right?
Right.
And obstreperous,
Obstreperous, that's a good word, isn't
he was obstreperous. Well, we would say stroppy, right? He was a stroppy character. So he actually campaigned on behalf of other Jewish refugees from the Nazis.
Right.
And his biographer estimates that he saved about 60 lives from his activities nudging the New Zealand government to let in more refugees.
So do we think he's stroppy because he was advocating so passionately?
No, it was just his entire personality was like that.
Yeah. But see, I wonder, actually, if it's the same thing. Like his personality was like that, but that's what made him a good advocate. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever called me, what's the word?
Obstreperous.
Obstreperous, but people have definitely
Stroppy being the
people have definitely called me Stroppy.
So I mean, but it's interesting to know. So this is one of the most, if not the most important philosopher ever to have worked in New Zealand, and not only did he produce a very famous and important political book whilst working here, he also saved the lives of 60 people.
I mean, I think the thing about Popper, for me, is that he doesn't seem like a New Zealand philosopher. He seems like an an international philosopher.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
And I think that's he's gone beyond. I mean, he always was because he was coming from outside. But he's one of those people that you think of when you think of famous philosophers, and particularly coming from a science background.
Yeah, that's right too. Because of course he's also very famous as a philosopher of science.
Yeah.
But you're right that you can look at philosophers who worked in New Zealand. Either native born or immigrants like me. Some of them are, as it were, philosophers who happen to live in New Zealand, and some of them are like New Zealand philosophers in that their work is specifically addressed to New Zealand concerns.
Yeah.
And actually, mostly they're in the first category. Most I think, philosophers who've been prominent, who have lived or worked in New Zealand, are kind of big internationally and not necessarily that big in New Zealand. Popper's slightly different because he did make a difference to the politics of higher education. Apparently he was very influential in introducing a number of reforms. Yeah. So he did make a difference here. But of course his primary focus was always, like big concerns which are not New Zealand specific.
No,
yeah.
True.
Yeah. And I guess the Times as well. Where was I up to? Charles, also an expert in the philosophy. Sorry, lost my train of thought there. Philosophy of conspiracy theories, being the first to revive the issue after Popper's denunciations of conspiracy theorising in the 40s, 50s and 60s. And we could talk for the whole episode just on that. But you also dabble your fingers in many philosophical pies. I don't know why I'm reading this all in third person. Chief interest is in meta-ethics. Now, I did promise Charles before the episode that I would get him to say, what is meta-ethics?
Okay, meta-ethics can be explained fairly simply. So there are ethical questions like what ought I to do, or how should we solve this problem, or how should we live, or what things are fundamentally right or what things are wrong, what things are good, what things are bad. Questions like that. These are normative questions about what we should do. Now, meta-ethics is not directly about those questions. Rather, it asks, what do we mean when we say somebody ought to do something? What do we mean when we say something is wrong? And furthermore, not just what do we mean, but are claims like this ever objectively justified? You might say, well, it's all just people's feelings, or something like that. Or, there's right and wrong here and right and wrong there, but there isn't an objective right or wrong. So it's an inquiry into whether or not there is an objective basis for ethics. And there are a whole range of positions that people take up on this.
And I'm sure that butts up against religion there quite a bit.
But not always in the direct way you might think, right? Because one way of one theory is, right and wrong is what God says it is, what God says they are. So that's the basis. But many religious thinkers have objected to this line of thought. And the reason they've objected is it makes the praise of God empty. If I say God is just, God is righteous, and all that means is something like God kind of approves of himself, that makes the praise of God empty. So quite a lot of deeply religious thinkers wanted to say, no, there is an objective basis for right or wrong, which is independent of God's will. And they did it not because they didn't really believe in God, right? They really did, and they really they wanted to say things like, God is just, God is great, God is holy, God is righteous. They wanted to say those things, but they felt that that is empty if you just reduce right and wrong to the will of God.
Right.
So that's a meta-ethical question which abuts on...
It's kind of interesting because it's like it comes right across to where atheists come to as well.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, one of the things that happens if you look at the historical development, which is in Europe in the 18th century, is you have these thinkers who say, well, look, I want an objective basis for ethics in order that I can praise God and in order I can say that God's commands are just and things like that. I can say those things in a contentful way. And then atheists come or atheist-inclined philosophers come along and say things like, well, now what do you need God for? Because we've got a basis for morality anyway.
And I guess that's the idea that just because I don't believe in God doesn't mean that I believe that we should go around murdering people. I don't need that commandment to tell me not to murder people.
Well, yeah, but I mean, what religious philosophers would typically say in response to this is, well, yeah, but you're not going to walk the straight and narrow path of virtue if you think that there's really no ultimate reward or punishment for doing it and punishment for not doing it. So they would say, yeah, morality exists independently of God's commands. We may even have a motive to do the right thing independently of God's commands. But we need God as a sort of backup to keep morality, keep people on the straight and narrow. And the atheists would have said, no, you don't need that. Actually, believing in God makes things worse. And then they will point to history to justify what they were saying.
Sorry, Trudi.
No, I was just thinking, do we need a carrot and a stick to make sure we remain on the virtuous path?
I mean, that's society, though, isn't it? Because that's somebody else telling you, whether it's society or God or the church or whoever, telling you what's right and what's wrong, rather than you just believing what's right and wrong.
Born with inherently moral values, they come from somewhere.
Do they? I don't know.
Well,
I don't know.
Well. Yeah. I mean, again, this is what sort of metaethics is all about. Yeah. These are the sorts of questions that metaethics is about. Where and is there any kind of objective basis? And there is also the problem that societies differ. Right now. If you want to say there's an objective basis for ethics, furthermore, that this is accessible to us, we can find out what's really right or wrong in whatever sense we analyse it, right? Then you've got a problem in that societies obviously disagree quite a lot about what's right or wrong. Hume, one of the people we're talking about, has a whole dialogue about this. It's quite interesting.
So it's kind of a strange thing, though, because I think you've got like lots of things that society says are right and wrong that are kind of trivial. Some of them less trivial and some of them more trivial. But, you take different religions that societies largely work under, then they have a different sort of set of rules. But most societies probably have a few core things that they believe in. But then there's always going to be exceptions to that, so I don't know. But I do think that there's possibly also, just coming from a biological point of view, there is, there's kind of, genetic or evolved strategies where societies where everyone just goes around killing everyone, that doesn't work. And so those
you can have societies where where a lot of people go around killing members of other societies. That's not incompatible with them.
That's not so
I was going to say history isn't proven that correct. We're very good at killing lots of other people.
Yeah, so I guess that's what I'm talking about, is that distinction between killing, like indiscriminate killing.
Yes.
Is generally frowned upon
quite
everywhere.
A lot of societies are quite keen on indiscriminate killing.
Well, so I think that outsider stuff. So we don't kill who's in our group.
So that's what I was going to say. So most societies, I think, have some sort of loophole where some degree of killing other people is acceptable.
Just a loophole? It's often a very large loophole.
Yeah, but still,
I wouldn't say, loophole.
For instance, you've got the Ten Commandments. You've got "Thou shalt not kill."
Yes,
and then you've got the Crusaders. So that's originally, that's a fairly large loophole.
Yes, but
I think we're getting a wee bit off track.
We are getting off track.
Let's go. Okay, so
we'll be here forever.
Yeah, so that's meta ethics. So Charles, defender of the error theory with special interests in Moore, Hume, and the is-ought question. Only philosopher of your acquaintance to have published a philosophical dialogue in blank verse, The Complots of Mischief.
Yeah, well, that's to do with my conspiracy theory work. So I published a paper a long time ago. And in fact, the story relates to what we were talking about, Popper, right? So the Otago Philosophy Department was for a long time led by my former chief, Alan Musgrave, who was a disciple of Karl Popper. He studied with him at the London School of Economics. And, we were not uncritical, but, it was a Popperian sort of department for a long time.
Popperian sort of department.
A Popperian sort of department.
Wow.
And there was a friend of the department who'd actually been a student of Popper's in Canterbury in the 1940s. He was an elderly retired brewer.
Mm.
And
Like a beer brewer?
Yes. And he kept this up in later life. He brewed, he did home brew, and he also, I think, don't know if he distilled whiskey, but anyway, but he used to come to our seminars. We had weekly seminars, and he was a regular attender. And he was a friend of the department, as I say, and he used to invite us round once a year to drink his home brewed beer and soak it up with rather unappetizing pizza. And but before we sort of started destroying the brain cells with the beer, we were supposed to do an intellectual party piece, and it was my turn to do this. And I thought, well, this is a disciple of Popper's. I'm happy to talk about Popper, but I'm not just going to do a little paper where I just sing the praises of Popper. How about doing something on some theme where I think Popper had something interesting to say, but which I thought he was wrong?
Right. It's always the best premise for an argument or party piece.
Yeah. And so basically what I did, and we're sort of jumping ahead to one of the topics, but was to critique Popper's idea that there is such a thing as the conspiracy theory of society, and that people who believe in conspiracies believe in the conspiracy theory of society, and that therefore conspiracy theories in general are irrational, right? That's an idea that's there in Popper. So caricaturing somewhat, but yes, that's the idea in there. So I did my party piece. Then we sort of started drinking the beer, and after I'd sobered up, I thought, well, look, there's a philosophical paper in this. So I wrote it up, sent it off. It was published. And then other people started writing about the philosophy of conspiracy theories. So my basic idea in conspiracy theories is very, very simple. It's this. People frequently conspire. History of almost every society, every culture is littered with conspiracies. The only societies where there aren't conspiracies are where the society is so small and so open that it's not possible to conspire or keep a secret.
Can we just slot in a definition of conspiracy?
Yeah, very easily. Conspiracy is a secret plan to influence events with partly secret means.
And shared by more than, typically I think they say 3 people.
3 people at minimum, but they can be much, much larger. Yeah. And there's often the implication that somebody will disapprove.
Right.
But not necessarily that it's bad, right, but somebody will disapprove. So think of the Stauffenberg plot, right? What was the Stauffenberg plot? It was a plot to assassinate Hitler with a view to bring the World War II to an end. It was by a group of German officers.
More than 3.
Considerably more than 3. Failed partly because the guy who was planting the bomb had lost several fingers on the Eastern Front. And so he was found it difficult to plant the bomb.
But he couldn't get in the right place.
He fumbled the bomb.
No, you had to get the suitcase and you got it on the other side of the table leg or something, so it didn't kind of...
That just seems like poor planning. If you're going to have a conspiracy, have the guy have all his fingers.
Yeah, but when you're waiting for the Gestapo to hang you up on butcher's hooks, it's very stressful.
It is kind of stressful. Yes. And anyway, the Stauffenberg plot failed, but the point is Hitler disapproved of the Stauffenberg plot, but we can think... hooray for the Stauffenberg plot. This is a conspiracy which was disapproved by some people, but it was a secret plan to influence events by partly secret means. And you can add perhaps a few other cancelable things. So one of the objections to my definition is, doesn't that mean that the secret surprise birthday party is a conspiracy?
Yes, so is it
it's a secret plan by more than 3 people.
To change
events,
but you can add that the events have to be sort of sufficient, some pith and moment, right? You add that clause to bring it in.
Moment?
Pith and moment.
So
Matters of great pith and moment. It's a Shakespeare quote.
Oh, right, okay. Sorry. Showing my ignorance here.
So a conspiracy plot is only bad depending on the circumstance. So we would think the Strafenberg plot was a good idea, but Hitler wouldn't. Again, a very famous historical conspiracy, the conspiracy to murder Julius Caesar on the Ides of March in 44 BC, as we would now put it, right?
Yeah.
Now,
I guess that if you go back to the birthday party, though, it's not like, I mean, both those other examples of conspiracy theories were very bad for the person that they were conspiring, that they were keeping the secret from, whereas you could argue that a birthday party, I mean, people might not like them because they're embarrassed to be the centre of attention or whatever, but it's not very bad for them.
Well, depends on
I think basically I exclude this by saying it's got to be about something important, right? The birthday party is not important. And then
But does it not have to be something negative for the other party as well as something important?
Negative for someone, but not negative.
Whereas a surprise birthday party doesn't have a bad connotation.
Unless you rock up with your boyfriend and your husband standing there in the corner. Yeah, it could be embarrassing.
That would be the kind of thing. You could certainly imagine a surprise birthday party where it was like a way of humiliating the person, you know.
Yeah. But see, then I think
imagine writing a mean comedy, right, where it was like a surprise birthday party after surprise birthday party, and every single one. The point is to humiliate the birthday boy or the birthday girl, right? You know, it could be quite fun, but we basically exclude that from the definition by insisting that it should be about important stuff.
I think it's more that it has to be bad. There has to be some
bad for somebody.
Bad for somebody,
and bad for somebody
who's outside the conspiracy.
Yes. And there are issues with this definition, like how secret does a conspiracy have to be? Anyway,
how bad does it have to be, or how important does it have to be?
But so my basic point is that history is absolutely littered with conspiracies. You know, conspiracy is one of the main mechanisms of history. Every time there is a coup d'etat, or almost every time there's
Jim
a coup d'etat.
Bolger when he got rolled by Jenny Shipley.
I actually use that as an example. Yes, because that was a conspiracy, right? So, Jim Bolger is the Prime Minister, and if you want, even in a democratic society, so this is a democratic society, it's not like there are knives or anything like that. Whatever you might think of her, Jenny Shipley was, I mean, she's still alive, but she was a democratic politician operating according to a bunch of norms. But it's still a conspiracy because in order to roll Jim Bolger, she had to furtively feel out enough people to make sure that she had enough support so that when the time came, they could ring me up and say, look, you've lost, we've got the numbers. You will be voted out, step down, right?
And one might say they even waited till he was overseas to do it.
Yeah, probably that was a part of the conspiracy. But anyway, it was a conspiracy. And this is actually typical of leadership spills in democratic parties, right? Very often you want to get rid of, Bob Hawke or Bill Hayden. I'm talking about Australian examples here. Yeah. But, how was this done? Well, you, the leader of the coup, and remember, this is a democratic coup. Nobody's getting killed. Nothing really terrible is happening. But you have to plot with your allies and make sure that you've got the numbers. So when the time comes and the crucial vote happens, you'll win. Because
it'll all be done within the party framework as well, for the party rules.
So are we saying that this is a perfectly acceptable mechanism of politics?
I wasn't making. I wasn't making that judgment, but the point is, this is a conspiracy, and
it's a fact that it happens.
And this sort of thing happens very much, and this is even in democratic societies, right? This is there's nobody, as I say, nobody's getting killed, nobody's getting murdered.
And essentially you're working within the rules
and
that are there.
you're working within the rules, yes.
So it's not that you're, rampaging across the rules, just not using guns.
So, Adam Smith, the famous economist, actually says that employers are generally in a conspiracy to force down the wages to their employees.
Yeah, I agree with him. I think they are. I think supermarkets are in a conspiracy to force up the prices of groceries as well.
This is where two historical mechanisms interact. I call them the invisible hand. An invisible hand mechanism is where people are acting to achieve their own ends, but their collective action produces an end that they're not necessarily intending, right? Could be good, could be bad, right?
Supermarkets are not intending to increase the prices.
And conspiracies are where people are deliberately plotting to bring about an end. Now, of course, they might not succeed in doing it, but they're deliberately doing it. So they're invisible hand mechanisms and they're hidden hand mechanisms, as I call them.
Right.
Hidden hand's a conspiracy. Invisible hand is basically, this is the sort of thing we do in economics. You mentioned the PPE program, which I've been an enthusiastic part of.
Philosophy, politics, and economics.
And what we do in the economics part, and also in the other two parts, is explore invisible hand mechanisms.
Right.
But we shouldn't neglect hidden hand mechanisms either. They're both crucial to the way societies work.
Well, I'm going to have to go over these again. Okay, so the difference between a hidden hand is a hidden hand is a conspiracy.
Yeah.
So a hidden hand is like a magician. He knows what he's doing.
Yes.
Or the conspiracy people know what they're doing. They're just deliberately hiding it from view.
Yeah.
Whereas an invisible hand is just kind of an outcome that happens from things that people have done, but they didn't do those things intentionally.
Yeah.
Hoping for that outcome.
So the classic, it comes from Adam Smith. He says that people operating in a market pursuing their own self-interest, and they're just trying to make a profit. That's what they're trying to do.
Right.
Boost the prosperity of the country.
Right.
And in particular, they sort of promote exports and things like that. So the basic, why is capitalism at least sometimes good? Because the invisible hand mechanisms operating in a competitive market tend to mean that goods are produced at the lowest price compatible with making a profit, and this promotes general prosperity, welfare, production, etc. When capitalism is working as it should, that's the explanation of how it works.
It should.
Well, and going back to going back to your example of the supermarkets.
Yeah.
The invisible hand mechanism in the market works when there are a lot of players. There are a lot of competing companies. And the problem with the New Zealand supermarket is it's a duopoly.
Yeah.
That is, there are basically just two companies. And that's not enough to promote the right kind of competition and for capitalist mechanisms to work in the way they're supposed to do.
Yeah,
and the Commerce Commission is designed, I don't say it's good at its job, right, but is designed to create the conditions so that market mechanisms, invisible hand mechanisms, produce beneficial effects, and there isn't too much concentration of power in the hands of a small number of companies, because in that case the market mechanism doesn't work as it should.
I think,
and that's one of the things we talk about in PPE.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, for me, there's the premise built into that argument that if only there were more supermarkets, then the system would work.
Yeah.
Or you have government intervention to correct the market failure.
It seems like it's a very unfalsifiable proposition, though, because say, well, it's not work. I mean, it would work, but it's
falsifiable. Or you just, because
you say, well, it's not. Here's a system. It's not working. Therefore, we need to have more.
Well, if you, it's falsifiable because if you create a situation where there are a lot of competing supermarkets, separate companies, and the price of commodities goes down, then then the prediction is confirmed. And if it doesn't go down, it's disconfirmed. So it's definitely falsifiable.
Yeah, but
it's just that you have to do it.
It's falsifiable, but then the problem is that proponents of it say, but it didn't work because of this. So you're saying it. So you're not scrapping the whole thing. You're saying, but it doesn't work. Whereas I would say it's...
So are we talking about but? Does that lead us to is ought?
It does.
Oh, well, we are. jump away. We could. Let's just talking a bit about PPE, which is kind of on my mind because the PPE program has just been reviewed,
so that's a degree that someone can take at the University of Otago, right?
Yes,
PPE.
you can take a major in philosophy, politics, and economics,
and it does seem to be a thing that a lot of aspiring politicians.
I think anybody doing anything should at least do a PPE. If you're going to go into law or if you're going to go into business or anything.
Lots of our students agree with you because about 2/3 of us, this was in the past, it may have shifted a bit, but when I did the statistics, which was a while ago, 2/3 of PPE students are doing some kind of double degree. Mm-hmm. And of that 2/3 are doing law.
Yeah,
so
interesting.
2/3 of the 2/3.
Yeah. I think it's just such a really good grounding is perhaps not the right word. It's more than a grounding, but I think it's just such a deeper outlook rather than a specific.
Well, I was talking to my husband this morning. So we both have PhDs, so a doctorate of philosophy.
Yes.
But neither of us has ever taken a philosophy paper because they're, life sciences PhDs. And so we were sort of saying it's weird that it's not compulsory to do at least critical thinking or, logic as part of a doctorate. Like to me, like if you think about it rationally, it is strange. And Ralph was like, it's just... So
you're both life sciences, right?
Yes, yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a question of what the nature of philosophy is. So once upon a time, philosophy was everything, right? Mm-hmm. Everything, right? Every kind of study almost, except theology. And what gradually happens is that areas of inquiry start to develop a methodology of their own, start to develop, and it's particularly tends to be one which involves empirical confirmation or disconfirmation, right? And once that happens, they spin off out of philosophy, right? But, so there's spin-off, right? But there's also a little bit of spin-on. So what happens is, you're doing, let's say, let's talk about, biology. There are problems, conceptual problems with evolutionary theory. I mean, it's a dominant theory, but there are things like what level does selection pressures operate? Do they operate on the gene? Do they operate on the organism? Can they sometimes operate on groups of organisms? And how do we sort of think about this? Now, this is theoretical biology, right? Yeah. But it's also philosophy of biology. Yeah. There's really very little difference between what my friends who do philosophy of biology do and what a theoretical biologist does. They shade into one another. And that's because lots of inquiries, even though they've got enough methodological autonomy not to be part of philosophy, still generate philosophical questions. That's a very good example of it. And, in economics, another example would be, there's a big debate in economics about what we should consider the economic agent as like. In the past, there's been a tendency to think of the economic agent as Homo economicus, the economic man, right, who maximizes their own utility. And there's often a bit of a sort of havering between the person maximizing their own personal welfare, or we just saying, it's whatever you like, right? It could be altruistic, and you're maximizing that. You're trying to move as much as possible, whatever the things that you value or desire. Or is that not a good model for what human beings are like, even in economic contexts? So you have a split between classical or neoclassical economists and what are called behavioral economists. And this is kind of a philosophical question. It's also a question in economics. There isn't like a sharp boundary here. Though you should be careful about talking about any of this stuff without some grounding in the relevant disciplines.
Oh, that sounds like I'm not allowed to talk about it.
No. What I mean is philosophers shouldn't talk about this without, taking the trouble to acquaint themselves with at least a reasonable amount of economics or biology or whatever. And all the people who do that. So going back to conspiracy theory, I've read history it's my chief passion apart from philosophy, and I've been reading it since I was 8. So, I do know a lot of history, and consequently I can talk about conspiracy theories and the fact that conspiracies are prevalent in history with some degree of confidence.
Yeah, I guess there's the difference between conspiracy theories that are, conspiracies that are real, right? And then you move on to the idea, which brings us back to the is-ought question as well, I think.
All right, let's do is-ought. Let's go back to is-ought.
Back to facts, right? Because then you get... Because the thing with conspiracy theories is that the ones that we've discussed are the ones that are actually real. So there are such things as conspiracy theories. Of course there are. That's how politics moves forward. And many other things. But then, of course, there are conspiracy theories that are deliberately not true.
Deliberately not true is a question. Let's just say definitely not true, right?
Okay.
There are plenty of conspiracy theories which are crazy. So
the moon landing.
So my basic shtick is, look, just because something features a conspiracy, a theory features a conspiracy, it could be true, it could be false, it could be sensible, it could be silly, just like any other kind of theory, right? People have theories about all sorts of stuff. Some theories are well-confirmed, rational sorts of things that are actually true or might be true. Some theories are just like bonkers or have been now discarded by the march of science. So that something is a theory doesn't mean that it's either true or false. That something is a conspiracy theory doesn't mean it's either true or false. But there is an interesting issue, right, about can we distinguish between those conspiracy theories which are sensible and those which are silly, those which have some reasonable chance of being true and those which are can be ruled out. So, my early work, I just talked about the fact that just because something involves a conspiracy, that doesn't mean that it's false or silly. The idea that you can just label something a conspiracy theory and then dismiss it, that's wrong. But of course, that doesn't mean that lots of conspiracy theories aren't pretty bonkers, because lots of them are. So
is that just terminology then, that we've failed to distinguish between, we failed to appropriately think up a word or a name for a conspiracy theory? I
think the problem is that the word is used, the definition as it involves a fallacious slide. So you start by saying, this is a theory which involves a conspiracy, right? Premise. Next move, this is a conspiracy theory. Intervening step. Third move, this theory is bonkers. Right? Because you kind of accept or presuppose the idea that conspiracy theories as such are bonkers. And that's silly because many of them are not, right? But of course many of them are. So the interesting question is, can we sort of devise markers for distinguishing between those conspiracy theories which might be true or, are sensible, and those which we can maybe dismissed because of inherent factors in the nature of the theory.
And what's the answer? Can we?
It's a bit complicated, but I think we can. So let me give you one way of distinguishing between them, right? So now I'll be switching between talking about a conspiracy and a theory about a conspiracy, but we need to be... So consider some conspiracies are defectible. What does that mean? It means that you can betray the conspiracy, you can defect from the conspiracy at a low personal cost, right? You betray the conspirators, nothing bad happens to you.
So I'm a minor player.
No, you could be a big player. It's just a feature of the conspiracy. That
I'm not going to get taken by the Gestapo and shot.
Yeah.
Well, it depends. Basically. Yeah, if it happens early enough, is it a time factor?
Well, it could be a time factor as well. But so let me give you a non-defectable conspiracy, right?
Yeah.
So it's Chicago. It's 1929. The city is in the grip of prohibition, and the city is in the grip of the mafia as governed by Al Capone, right? And you are part of the conspiracy, right? You may be a mafioso yourself. You may be paying a protection racket, but also getting kickbacks of one kind or another to promote your business. Maybe all the mafia coming and eating in your restaurant.
Right.
you could be a policeman or a judge on the take.
All right.
You could be involved in a gambling racket or prostitution or something, right? Any of these things, you could be making money out of this and leading an agreeable lifestyle. Now, perhaps you're conscience-stricken about this, and you want to say, well, I want to get out of it. But what happens if you betray the conspiracy to the feds? Well, it's fictionalized, but we've all seen The Untouchables, Your blood and brains are going to be splattered over the elevator walls, right? And possibly they will murder your family and children as well. So this kind of conspiracy, right, is a big, big, big mafioso conspiracy, is not defectable. The costs of defecting from it are enormously high. At the very best, you're going to have to go into a witness protection program and be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life, right? So the costs of defection are high and the rewards of defection are pretty low. The only way you'd ever go for this is if they've already got you on some other charge, right?
Or if enough other people were simultaneously going to defect to make it.
That would be a conspiracy.
That would be, it would. But anyway, so we have defectable conspiracies and non-defectable conspiracies.
And it's dependent on the cost to the person who's deciding to defect.
Yes. Okay. Now, suppose you have a conspiracy theory which posits a highly defectable conspiracy from which there have been no defections.
Right. Then it's wrong.
Then it's probably false.
That makes sense, right? Because if it was easy to defect, then for one reason or another, someone would have.
Yeah. Okay, so now let me give you an example, right, of a crazy conspiracy theory. Climate change is a hoax put up by designing scientists to line their own pockets with research grants and to advance
I didn't tell them that I worked in climate change science.
Advance their lefty agendas, right? The climate change is a hoax theory, right?
Yep.
Okay, now this is a conspiracy theory because all you evil, climate scientists have to be in on it, right, for it to work. So it's a huge, huge multinational conspiracy.
Yep. Which requires all the scientists to all, large number to all agree to keep it a secret that it's a conspiracy.
Yep, that's right. And so, and it's highly defectable. So suppose this conspiracy were real, suppose this conspiracy theory were true, just imagine, you decide that you're going to betray the conspiracy theory, you would be on the gravy train for life. Every right-wing talk show would be falling over themselves to have you on. You'd be getting grants from people like the Koch brothers, I'd be
making lots of easy research money.
Easy research money. It would be a bonanza, right? But there would be no defections. So it's a highly defectable it's a theory featuring a highly defectable conspiracy from which there have been no defections.
Right.
So that's a reason for thinking that it's false.
Right. That it's not false as in it's not a conspiracy theory, it is actually true.
No, that's a reason for thinking that the conspiracy theory that climate change is a hoax is false.
Yes, right.
Because if it were true, it would be a highly defectable conspiracy from which there are no defections.
Yeah.
So that's a criterion for one thing. It's not the only thing. There are other things, like some conspiracy theories involve, flying in the face of obvious facts, obvious scientifically well-established facts. That's another reason.
Right.
Another one, though you had to be really careful about this one, is the conspiracy involves surreal degrees of wickedness on the part, James Bond villain wickedness on the part of the conspirators. But you had to be very careful with that one because there are some examples of
evil does exist in the world, right?
Yeah, but like evil, we can cope with
evil actions.
We can cope with evil actions. We can cope with people being cruel or callous or self-interested. That's fine. But there are some conspiracy theories where it's kind of like over-the-top loony wickedness. And we can say, well, maybe that's the ground for suspicion. But we really have to be careful here because there are examples of real-world conspiracies where the conspirators were insanely evil. So a good example would be the Holocaust.
I was just going to say it's
because here's the thing. This was planned and plotted and largely executed in secret. It's a long time before people realized, enough people outside, what was going on. And there's a movie about the Wannsee Conference, which is where they basically planned it. The title of that movie is Conspiracy. And that's right. It was a conspiracy. And
it's that whole idea that
another example would be Stalin's Great Terror.
I was just going to say, people take that as a thing. Like, if it's crazy enough, they don't expect the general like, if it's so evil, if it's so crazy, then people just don't believe it. Is a conspiracy? Does that make? Because I think that's what happened a little bit with the Holocaust when first sort of little bits of information were coming out into the rest of the world. People just said, no, that's too crazy, that's too evil. That can't be.
I'm not sure that might be true, but I know much more about another example, nearly contemporary.
Right.
So Stalin's Great Terror. Now, what happened in the Great Terror, which is from the late 1930s on, was Stalin just purged his own party. I mean, lots of other people as well, but his own party. And he framed hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people on trumped-up charges and either executed them or sent them off to the Gulag. And people who thought, that maybe communism was okay just couldn't believe that he would do this if there were not a real conspiracy. So it's interesting. This is a second-order conspiracy. Right?
Yeah.
But they couldn't believe that he would do this because it seemed so insanely evil, right? Like, why? Because even now, people were puzzled. Why did you do this? Why? Because he decimated, more than decimated. Decim means 10. 1 in 10.
Yeah.
1 in 10. He massacred about half of the officer corps when he's expecting an invasion from Hitler.
That's
so it seems insane, and it was. So that's an example why I said should be careful about conspiracies theories which posit insane or sort of bonkers or surreal evil on the part of the conspirators. The problem with that criterion is we know of at least two conspiracies where pretty much it does look like it's bonkers. And in the case of Stalin, what you said about Hitler is definitely true. We know journalists who said things like, well, I can't believe that they would execute all these people on trumped-up charges if there were nothing behind it. Obviously, and that meant they believed in a rival conspiracy theory, right? There was a conspiracy of wreckers in the Soviet elite which needed to be exposed. So that's an example where why I said don't believe in conspiracy theories where the alleged conspirators are like insanely and surreally wicked. That's one you should apply with a lot of caution. But if someone says, well, maybe it's Bill Gates who wants to infect us all with some microchip so that we'll become infertile or something, that's. Why would he want to do that? He's going to lose business.
I mean, and that's the thing, though, isn't it? To some people, it seems not beyond the realm of possibility, and I guess that's where the tricky part comes in.
Well, this was a weakness of my approach for a long time, and it's still perhaps a weakness in my approach. How can we distinguish between true and false conspiracy theories, crazy and non-crazy conspiracy theories? Part of the problem is that. I used to say, well, you have to read history. But that's not really an answer. You develop a sense of what's historically plausible and what's historically... And it's clear that lots of people just haven't read very much history, so they have no idea how the world works. But, that's not much, If I'd been reading history as my chief pleasures since I was 8 and I'm now 60, I've read a lot of history. You can't expect that of everybody.
And that's not going to work very well with democracy, is it? If we're expecting the general populace to...
No. Well, I think it would be a good idea if most people read more history, but not. Maybe you can't give people enough history to give them the kind of
the context in it.
So that's. to some extent, I think that's still at the back of some of these criteria. But now, I have been trying to develop rules. Another one is...
We're running out of time here.
And we haven't even done is and ought.
So we're going to have to leave is and ought for another time.
Happy to give you another go on is and ought.
But I think it's really interesting, conspiracy theories, especially in the times that we live in now, because there are a lot of conspiracy theories floating around. And if we take the American example and we leave currently, but we go back to the Benghazi, the idea that the Clintons were running a child crazy sex thing in a pizza parlour somewhere. It's beyond silly. It's beyond evil. So I would immediately,
that's an example.
Thought,
it's like,
put that into that's too crazy to be real.
Yes,
but then of course, 70 million people in America didn't put it in that basket. So that's where I think just relying on people to say, "Oh, that's too crazy." But hey, this has been really interesting. Honestly, I could sit here and talk for the rest of the day. And you've given us all lots to think about on our Good Friday. So it has been it has been an absolutely fabulous hour of discussion.
Well, thank you.
I'm sorry that we didn't get through all of the million things, but you just have been too prolific and too widely known about all things. Because I could go back and talk about Popper for...
Oh, yeah, we could talk about him.
I could talk about Russell for quite some time as well.
Too.
Or listen to you talk about him as well. But hey, fantastic to have you on the show here, and thank you very much for coming along today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Matiwa.
Matiwa. You've been listening to the OI Podcast, the shout-out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI Podcast on OAR FM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.